The heat that August morning descended upon Ruby Ridge like molten lead, heavy and suffocating. The sun climbed a sky bleached white as bone-draining color from everything beneath the weathered storefronts, with their peeling paint, the packed earth of the main street, even the faces of the men who gathered there. Dust rose with every footfall and settled on hats, boots, the wooden railings that lined the walkways. The air tasted of alkali and desperation, thick enough to choke on. Takala stood in the narrow shade, cast by the livery stable, his back pressed against sun-warmed planks, and watched the crowd assemble around the rope enclosure in front of the auction house. He had ridden into Ruby Ridge before dawn to collect his Army Scout pension from the territorial office and sell 5 ponies to the trader's simple business that should have occupied no more than an hour. He had not intended to linger. This town, with its veneer of respectability stretched thin over casual brutality, made his skin crawl. But then he had seen the chalkboard propped against the auction house porch, its message written in chalk so white it hurt to look at: labor indenture contracts. 4 orphan girls, 1 lot. His stomach had clenched like a fist around hot iron. Inside the rope enclosure, 4 girls stood in a ragged line on bare earth. Their dresses, once perhaps blue or green, or some color that had mattered to someone, had faded to a uniform gray-brown, and the fabric thin and patched at the elbows and knees. Their hair hung in braids pulled so tight, the skin around their temples looked stretched and painful. The oldest girl, perhaps 16, with eyes the color of winter smoke that swept across the crowd with the wariness of a hunted animal, held her shoulders square, despite the fear that showed in the white-knuckled grip of her hands. Beside her stood 3 younger girls, each a step down in height, one perhaps 14 with watchful brown eyes that missed nothing. Another maybe 11 with a stubborn set to her jaw that suggested she had learned early not to cry. And the smallest, no more than 9, who flinched violently every time the auctioneer's walking stick struck the wooden rail. Takala knew what he was looking at. He had seen it before in other towns scattered across the territories. The orphan trains brought children west from the crowded eastern cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, with promises of fresh air and loving families eager to adopt. But the reality that awaited many of these children was grimmer. Too often they ended up as unpaid labor bound by contracts that were slavery in everything but name. Some disappeared entirely, swallowed by mines or lumber camps, or the vast indifference of the frontier, their names struck from ledgers as if they had never existed. Each time before, Takala had told himself it was not his concern. He was Lakota, and these were white children caught in white men's systems. Interfering brought nothing but trouble, and he had learned the hard way that walking the line between 2 worlds meant being trusted fully by neither. He had learned to keep his head down, collect his pension, conduct his business, and leave before someone decided to make an example of him. But standing there in the meager shade, watching the smallest girl flinch as if expecting a blow, he found himself remembering other children. A Lakota winter camp he had led soldiers to 3 years ago, when he still believed the Army's promises about protecting peaceful bands who stayed on their assigned lands. He remembered the faces of children as the bluecoats rode in with rifles raised. Remembered the mother who had shoved her daughter behind her body in a futile gesture of protection. Remembered the sound that followed a sound he still heard sometimes in the space between sleep and waking. He closed his eyes, but the memory refused to fade. It never did. It lived in his chest like a stone he could not swallow and could not spit out. When he opened his eyes again, the auctioneer, a narrow man with a face like a hatchet and sweat stains spreading from his armpits in dark crescents, was raising his walking stick to tap the rail and signal the start of bidding. The smallest girl, her brown eyes wide with terror, flinched so hard she nearly fell backward into her sister. Takala's feet were moving before his mind had fully made the decision. He pushed away from the wall, and began walking toward the enclosure. His moccasins made no sound on the hard earth, but men turned to watch him anyway. A Lakota warrior in full regalia, buckskin shirt fringed at the shoulders, leggings decorated with quill work, a war bonnet trailing eagle feathers that marked him as someone who had earned honors in battle, was not a common sight on Ruby Ridge's main street. The crowd parted without him having to ask, men stepping aside instinctively, some with expressions of curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. He stopped at the rope, his presence creating a ripple of silence that spread outward like water from a stone. The auctioneer paused, his walking stick held mid-air. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed with calculation. "Can I help you, friend?" "Put the stick down," Takala said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that years of commanding scouts in hostile territory had taught him. Not a shout, not a threat, but something that made men listen. The walking stick remained frozen in the air. The auctioneer's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced toward a thick-shouldered man standing beside him. Magnus Olsson Takala would learn later the girl's supposed guardian. Magnus reeked of whiskey, even at this distance, the smell mixing with stale sweat and something sour that suggested weeks without proper washing. "What did you say?" Magnus asked, his voice carrying the belligerence of a drunk, trying to assert authority he did not truly possess. "Put the stick down." Takala repeated this time, looking directly at Magnus. "You do not strike children. Not while I stand here." Magnus's face went from red to purple. He took a step forward, his hand falling to the knife at his belt, but the auctioneer grabbed his arm. "Now hold on," the auctioneer said quickly, his voice taking on the oily smoothness of a practiced negotiator. "There is no call for trouble here. This is a legal proceeding properly documented and sanctioned by the county. These girls are orphans' wards of their uncle here, and the contracts being offered are standard indenture agreements, all according to territorial law. If you have concerns about the process, I suggest you take them up with the sheriff." "I have no concerns about the process," Takala said. "I have concerns about cruelty, and I have a question." He paused, letting the silence stretch until every eye in the crowd was on him. How much for their contracts all for? The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer, a horse stamped and blew through its nostrils. But the crowd made no sound at all. Then someone laughed, a short, harsh bark of disbelief. Others joined in the sound, rippling through the assembled men like wind through dry grass. The auctioneer's smile was thin and did not reach his eyes. "Well, now that is an interesting proposition. But as I said, these are legal contracts meant for citizens who can read and sign proper documents, who have established homesteads or businesses, who can provide Christian upbringing and—" "I can read," Takala interrupted. "I was required to learn English and how to read maps and orders when I served as a scout for the army. I can sign my name. And I have money." He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, and the kind that scouts carried for valuables, and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. With deliberate slowness, he unfolded it on the rail separating him from the auctioneer. Silver dollars gleamed in the harsh sunlight, stacked neat as cordwood. 20, 30, 40 coins, more wealth than most men in Ruby Ridge saw in a month. "These were paid to me by the United States Army." Takala said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent crowd. "For 3 years of service tracking in hostile territory north of the Platte River. The vouchers are signed by Quartermaster James Hodgson, stamped in St. Paul by Territorial Administrator Harrison Webb. You know they are genuine. I collect my pension from the Territorial Office in this very town every quarter. You have processed my vouchers yourself." The auctioneer's tongue darted out to wet his lips. his eyes fixed on the silver with an intensity that made his calculations obvious. But he was not the man who made decisions here. From across the street near the entrance to the Silver Dollar Saloon, a large figure pushed away from the porch post where he had been observing the proceedings. Sheriff Amos Crowley was a man built like a draft horse, with a thick neck, massive shoulders, and hands that looked capable of bending iron bars. His tin star caught the sunlight as he crossed the street with deliberate slowness, his boots striking the boardwalk with sounds like hammer blows. "Tokala," Crowley said as he reached the rope. He did not sound friendly, but neither did he sound immediately hostile. His tone was that of a man conducting an assessment, weighing options, and calculating outcomes. "You really want to buy 4 white girls?" "I want to purchase their labor contracts," Tokala corrected carefully, as territorial law permits any man with lawful currency to do. "Is there a statute that forbids this?" Crowley's eyes narrowed. He looked at the coins glinting on the rail, looked at Magnus standing beside the auctioneer with his face flushed and his fists clenched, looked back at Tokala. Behind the sheriff's calculating gaze, Tokala could practically see the wheels turning, weighing profit against potential complications. The sheriff was not a stupid man. Brutal, certainly. Tokala had heard stories about prisoners who entered Crowley's jail and never emerged. Corrupt, undoubtedly. Everyone knew the sheriff took a cut from these auctions, from the saloon gambling tables, from the brothels on the edge of town. But not stupid. Stupid men did not survive long as sheriffs on the frontier. "The money is good," Crowley said finally, pitching his voice to carry across the crowd, making his pronouncement official. "Army vouchers are as solid as gold coin. Legal tender recognized by the territory. If he signs the papers proper, pays the processing fee, and takes legal responsibility for the contracts, then it is a legitimate sale. Same as any other buyer here today." Magnus sputtered, his face going from purple to a mottled combination of red and white. "Now hold on just one blasted minute, Sheriff. These are my kin, my brother's wife's daughters. I got legal guardianship papers signed by a judge in St. Paul. You can't just—" Crowley turned his head, slowly fixing Magnus with a stare that could have frozen boiling water. Then he leaned close, his hand settling on Magnus's shoulder in a grip that looked friendly, but made the other man wince visibly. The sheriff spoke quietly, but Tokala's hearing, sharpened by years of scouting, of listening for the snap of a twig or the whisper of an arrow, caught every word. "You need money more than you need pride, Magnus. Your homestead is 3 months behind on the mortgage. The general store will not extend you any more credit. You came here today to sell these girls because you are desperate. So take his money and we will sort out any complications later if we need to. Legal sales leave paper trails, and trails can be followed in both directions. You understand me?" Magnus's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. His hands opened and closed. Finally, he yanked his hat off his head and slapped it against his thigh, raising a small cloud of dust. "Fine. Fine, sell them to the savage. See if I care what happens to them. They have been nothing but trouble since they arrived, eating my food, using my water, always needing something." The auctioneer, seeing which way the wind was blowing quickly, spread contract forms across a makeshift table, a plank laid across 2 barrels. His hands shook slightly as he smoothed the papers, as if he could not quite believe this was happening, but was determined to complete the transaction before someone changed their mind. "Standard contracts," the auctioneer said, his voice taking on the practiced patter of a man who had done this many times. "Terms of service, until each girl reaches 18 years of age. The purchaser assumes all responsibility for food, shelter, and clothing. The purchaser has the right to assign labor as needed, provided it does not result in permanent injury or death. The purchaser—" "I can read it," Tokala said. He took the pen the auctioneer offered, dipped it in the inkwell, and began signing where indicated. His handwriting was clear and precise despite the tremor in the auctioneer's hand as he held the contract steady. Tokala Hanska. The name that white men had shortened to simply Tokala because they could not be bothered to pronounce the second word properly. The coins were counted and stacked. $20 processing fee on top of the purchase price, an amount that made Tokala's jaw tighten, knowing it was pure graft. But he paid without comment. Magnus grabbed the coins with both hands, shoving them deep into his pockets, as if afraid someone might try to reclaim them, his eyes avoiding the girls entirely. Tokala turned to face the four sisters for the first time. 4 pairs of eyes stared back at him, gray, brown, blue, green, brown. Fear dominated their expressions, but beneath it, he saw other things. In the oldest girl's gray eyes, he saw wariness, but also fierce intelligence, a mind working rapidly to assess this new situation and calculate angles of survival. In the second girl's brown eyes, watchfulness and caution, the look of someone who had learned to observe before acting. In the third girl's blue-green eyes, a stubborn defiance that had not yet been beaten out of her. And in the youngest girl's brown eyes, naked terror mixed with a tiny spark of desperate hope. "My name is Tokala," he said quietly, pitching his voice so only they could hear him over the murmur that had resumed in the crowd. "It means fox in my mother's tongue. In Lakota, you may use whatever name you prefer." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I want you to understand something. You are not my property, though the law says I have bought your contracts. You are not anyone's property. But the law is what it is, and for now those contracts make me responsible for you. That means you will come with me and you will work, but only as much as is fair and necessary. And I promise you this: no man will strike you while I live and breathe. Do you understand what I am telling you?" The oldest girl studied his face for a long moment, her gray eyes searching for deception or hidden cruelty. Finally, she gave a single sharp nod. "My name is Annika," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. Her accent marked her as foreign-born Northern European, the words precise and carefully pronounced. "These are my sisters, Hannah, Colette, and Ruth. We will come with you because we have no other choice. But if you are lying about your intentions, we will find a way to make you regret it." The threat from a 16-year-old girl who probably weighed less than 100 pounds should have been laughable. But something in her eyes, a core of steel that adversity had forged rather than broken, made Tokala believe she meant every word. "I do not lie," he said simply. "Come." Together, they walked through the crowd. Tokala leading the 4 girls, following close enough that he could feel their presence at his back, like a physical weight. Men stared. Some muttered comments, not quite loud enough for Tokala to respond to, but loud enough for him to hear. Savage. Unnatural. What is he planning to do with them? Someone should tell the territorial office. A woman in a faded dress standing in the doorway of the general store brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with tears. But she said nothing and made no move to help. No one did. Tokala led them down the main street, past the saloon with its swinging doors, and the sound of off-key piano music past the general store, and the blacksmith's forge where sparks flew and metal rang against metal, past the assay office and the land claims office all the way to the edge of town, where cottonwood trees grew thick along a small creek. A cabin sat back among the trees, small and neat, with whitewashed walls and a shingled roof. A wooden fence, weathered gray, but sturdy, enclosed a yard, where chickens scratched in the dirt. A sign beside the door read, "Dr. Theodore Gray, physician and surgeon," in plain black letters. Tokala knocked 3 times firm and deliberate. The door opened to reveal a man in his middle years, perhaps 45, wearing shirt sleeves and a vest despite the heat. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, and his thinning hair had been combed back from a high forehead that gleamed with perspiration. Theodore Gray looked at Tokala, and then at the four girls standing behind him, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition followed by a wave of what might have been shame or regret, or some combination of both. "Come inside," Theodore said, stepping back quickly and glancing down the street as if checking whether anyone was watching. "All of you. Quickly now." Inside the cabin was dim and considerably cooler than outside. The air smelled of carbolic acid, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and old paper. Shelves lined the walls crowded with glass bottles containing powders and tinctures, medical texts with cracked leather spines, and neat stacks of journals. A desk occupied one corner, covered with papers and ledgers. A narrow bed stood against the far wall, its quilt faded but clean. A cast-iron stove radiated residual heat from breakfast cooking. Theodore poured water from a ceramic pitcher into tin cups, his hands trembling slightly, and distributed them to the girls. "Drink slowly," he instructed, his voice gentle. "Small sips." "When did you last have water?" "This morning," Annika replied. "Magnus gave us each one dipperful from the barrel before we left for town." Theodore's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. He poured more water without comment, then turned to Tokala. "You bought their contracts." "I did." "Do you understand the legal implications of what you have done?" Theodore removed his spectacles and began polishing them with a handkerchief pulled from his pocket, his eyes not meeting Tokala's. "You now legally own their labor until each reaches 18 years of age. You are responsible for their welfare, but you also have broad rights to assign them work. If you mistreat them, and proving mistreatment is extremely difficult under territorial law, I could attempt to have the contracts voided, but it would require a judge's order, and judges in this territory are not inclined to interfere with property rights. And Crowley," he broke off, shaking his head. "Crowley will watch you like a hawk. He profits from these sales." "How much does he profit?" Tokala asked. Theodore hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. He walked to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small leather notebook. "I started keeping records 3 years ago when I began to notice patterns. Every child sold through these auctions generates fees. Processing fees, transport fees, administrative oversight fees. The money is split 3 ways. Crowley takes roughly 30%, Magnus, or whoever is selling, takes 40%. And the remaining 30 goes to the county clerk in Goldwater, who processes the paperwork and maintains the official records. 30% of how much? It varies. For 4 girls, probably $120 total in fees on top of whatever you paid for the contracts themselves. Crowley just made $36 for standing there and declaring your money was good. He makes similar amounts 2 or 3 times a month when the orphan trains come through." Tokala felt cold anger settling in his gut. "That is a significant income." "Yes, which means he has a significant incentive to keep the system running smoothly. And you, by participating in an unexpected way, have disrupted his smooth operation. He will not forget that." Theodore replaced his spectacles and looked directly at Tokala for the first time. "What do you plan to do with them?" It was the question Tokala had been asking himself since he stepped forward at the auction. "Take them somewhere safe. There is land along the Cottonwood River between my people's seasonal camp and the white settlements. Neutral ground that is not claimed by the reservation or by any homesteader. I have kin there who will help protect them while I determine the next step." "And what is the next step?" Tokala met Theodore's gaze steadily. "To break the system that put them on that platform." Theodore's eyebrows rose sharply. That is an ambitious goal, also an extremely dangerous one. Yes, but necessary. Tokala glanced at the girls. Ruth had set down her cup and was staring at the jars on the shelves with wide eyes, as if she had never seen so many fascinating things in one place. Colette was examining a diagram of human anatomy pinned to the wall, her head tilted in concentration. Hannah remained close to Annika, watchful and tense. Annika herself was listening to the conversation with obvious intensity, her gaze moving between Tokala and Theodore. "Will you help?" Theodore was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to the wooden chest in the corner, knelt, and pulled out a thick stack of papers tied with string. He carried them to the desk and spread them out, the pages yellowed and covered with handwriting in various inks. "These are copies of health clearance forms I have been required to sign for the past 5 years," Theodore said quietly. "The railroad requires medical certification before children can be transported to prevent disease outbreaks on the trains. I signed these forms attesting that the children are free of contagious illness and fit for travel. I never thought much about it. I told myself I was simply doing my job, fulfilling a medical obligation." His voice grew bitter. "But I started keeping copies when I began receiving letters." "Letters?" Tokala asked. "From families searching for children. Parents who were told their children were being sent to good homes or who lost track of older siblings in the chaos of the immigrant processing centers. Sometimes from the children themselves, years later trying to find lost family members. They write to me because my name appears on the medical clearances." He pulled a separate bundle of letters from the drawer, the envelopes worn and stained. "I have 23 such letters. When I try to trace the children they ask about, I find nothing. Some are listed as runaways, who disappeared shortly after placement. Some are listed as deceased from various causes, illness, accidents, mishaps. Too many for it to be coincidence." Annika had moved closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the papers spread across its surface. Suddenly, she reached out her finger, stabbing at one particular form. This name. Mary Fisher. She was on the train with us from New York. She was 14. She got off at a stop in Nebraska. They told us she was going to a German family who owned a bakery. She was so happy because she loved to bake bread. Theodore found the corresponding entry in his records. According to this, Mary Fisher was placed with a laundry service at a mining camp in the Black Hills. Listed as deceased 6 months later. Cause of death, lung fever. Hannah had joined her sister at the desk. "Petri Korhonen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was Finnish like some of the others. Only 12 years old. Always reading when he could find books. They said he was going to a school teacher's family in Iowa." Theodore searched through his papers, his face growing grimmer. "Petri Korhonen, Petri. Placed with a freight company operating between here and Dakota Territory. Current status unknown, listed as runaway." "He would never run," Hannah said firmly. "He was terrified of being alone. He would never just run off." Tokala understood what he was looking at. The pattern Theodore had described was not a series of unfortunate coincidences. It was a system organized, profitable, and protected. The orphan trains and indenture auctions provided a steady stream of children who had no families to advocate for them, no connections to powerful people, no voices that anyone would listen to. They could be sold, exploited, worked to death, and when they died or disappeared, their names were simply struck from ledgers and forgotten. "You said the system runs through territorial offices," Tokala said slowly. "The same administrator who signs my pension vouchers also signs orphan placement contracts. Harrison Webb. What do you know about him?" Theodore's expression darkened. "Webb has been territorial administrator for 7 years. He controls disbursements, approves contracts, signs off on everything that involves territorial funds, including Army Scout pensions, including railroad subsidies, including orphan placement programs. And according to rumors I have heard from other physicians in the territory, he takes percentages from multiple revenue streams. But he is well connected in St. Paul, has the governor's ear, and is considered untouchable. Then we need proof, Tokala said. Evidence so clear that even powerful connections cannot protect him. The master ledger is in Goldwater, Theodore replied. At the county clerk's office. It lists every placement for the past decade, names, dates, buyers' fees, and most importantly, the approval signatures. If we could somehow obtain that ledger and get it to the territorial marshal, not the sheriff, but the marshal who answers directly to the governor, we might be able to force an investigation. Then we will obtain it, Tokala said simply. Theodore stared at him. That is theft of government property. If we are caught, we could be imprisoned. Or worse. Yes, Tokala agreed. But the alternative is to do nothing, and I am finished with doing nothing. They left Ruby Ridge before dawn 3 days later, traveling in Theodore's medical wagon with Tokala and the girls hidden under canvas in the back. Theodore had told anyone who asked that he was making his monthly circuit to outlying homesteads, a routine he had established years ago that no one questioned. Remedios, Ortega, the Mexican schoolteacher, sat beside him on the wagon's seat, a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the summer warmth. Tokala had met Remedios the previous evening when she appeared at Theodore's cabin, carrying 2 crates of books and a proposition. I hear you are building a school, she had said without preamble, her dark eyes direct and assessing. We are considering it, Tokala had replied carefully. Then you will need a teacher. I have been teaching on the south side of town for 8 years, the children whose parents are Mexican Indian or otherwise undesirable to the main school. I have watched too many of my students disappear into these contracts. Some I have tried to track with no success. If you are serious about building an alternative, I want to help. Now she sat beside Theodore, ostensibly accompanying him to tend to a difficult birth at a homestead 30 miles east. In reality, they were headed to Goldwater with the intention of committing what the law would consider theft. Inside the county office, a 2-story brick building near the train depot, worked a young clerk named Carlos Mendoza. Carlos was Remedios' nephew, placed in the position through family connections, and over the past 2 years, he had grown increasingly troubled by some of the records he processed. When Remedios had approached him with Theodore's theory, Carlos had confirmed the worst there was indeed a pattern. The fees were being split, as Theodore suspected, and Harrison Webb's signature appeared on approval forms for placements that Carlos privately believed were death sentences for children. Carlos had left the back door of the office unlocked as promised. They entered an hour after midnight, when Goldwater's streets were empty, except for drunks stumbling home from saloons and night watchmen making their rounds. Theodore carried a dark lantern that could be shuttered to hide its light. Remedios moved with surprising stealth for a woman of middle years. Tokala brought up the rear, his moccasins silent on the wooden floors. Carlos met them in the back room, his face pale with fear and determination. The ledger is in the safe, he whispered. I watched Horace Witt, the county clerk, open it last week. I memorized the combination. He knelt before the iron safe in the corner, pressing his ear against the metal as his fingers slowly rotated the dial. Click, pause, click, pause, click. The tumblers fell into place with sounds like distant thunder. The safe door swung open with a faint creak that seemed loud as a scream in the silent office. Inside, among stacks of deed records and land patents, sat a leather-bound ledger as thick as a man's forearm. Carlos lifted it with trembling hands, as if it might explode at any moment, and carried it to the table where Theodore had shuttered the lantern to its dimmest setting. They opened the ledger and began to read. Each page documented transactions in meticulous detail. Child's name, age, place of origin, date of placement, buyer's name, and location, purchase price. But there were additional columns that made Tokala's blood run cold with controlled fury. Administrative fee, with the initials AC, beside monetary amounts, Amos Crowley. Processing fee with HW, Horace Witt. And most damning, a third column marked territorial oversight fee, with amounts that were then subdivided, HW2 and per H. Webb St. Paul. Harrison Webb was not just signing approval forms. He was taking a percentage of every transaction. The child-selling ring ran straight to the territorial capital. Annika, who had insisted on coming despite Tokala's initial objections, leaned over the ledger, her finger trembling as it moved down the columns. "Mary Fisher," she whispered. "Sold to Black Hills Laundry Services for $75. Fees AC, 25 HW 15H, Web 10. Status deceased 8 months post-placement. Caused lung disease and complications." Her finger moved. "Petri Korhonen. Sold to Dalton Freight Company for $60. Fees split the same way. Current status, whereabouts unknown, presumed runaway." Page after page told the same story. Children sold, fees collected, lives ended or disappeared. Some listings had notes in the margins. Worker complaints disciplined. Attempted escape recaptured. Deceased mining accident. The ledger was not just evidence of financial corruption. It was a catalog of sanctioned murder. Theodore had brought his own notebook and began copying entries as fast as his hand could move his pen, scratching urgently across the paper. Remedios joined him, her teacher's handwriting precise and rapid. They worked in near silence, broken only by the scratch of pens and the occasional whisper as they confirmed entries. Then Annika's hand shot out, gripping Tokala's wrist hard enough that her nails bit through his shirt. "Someone is coming," she breathed. "I hear footsteps on the stairs." They all froze. In the sudden silence, Tokala heard it too. Heard the slow, heavy tread of boots on wooden steps, accompanied by the jingle of spurs. Someone was climbing the back staircase that led from the alley to the second-floor offices. Horace," a voice called, loud and jovial. "You working late again? I saw a light from the street and wanted to check. You know how I worry about you, old friend, working yourself to the bone with all these records." "Sheriff Amos Crowley." Carlos's face went white as milk. His eyes darted around the room, searching for escape or hiding places. Theodore moved with surprising speed for a man of his years, shoving the ledger back into the safe and spinning the dial. The numbers were meaningless now, but a locked safe looked less suspicious than an open one. Remedios doused the lantern, completely plunging them into darkness, relieved only by faint moonlight through the window. "The cabinet," Carlos whispered urgently, pointing at a large storage cabinet against the wall. "Quickly." Tokala, Annika, and Remedios pressed themselves into the cabinet, pulling the door closed just as the back room door opened and lamplight flooded in. Through the narrow crack between cabinet doors, Tokala could see Crowley's silhouette, massive shoulders and the tin star glinting on his chest, a revolver prominent on his hip. Crowley walked to the safe, his boots loud on the floor. He tried the handle. Locked. He grunted with satisfaction. "Everything's secure, I see." Good. Can't be too careful these days, Horace. I have been hearing rumors about troublemakers that Dr. Theodore Gray asking questions he should not be asking. And that Mexican schoolteacher writing letters to other towns, stirring up doubts about our placement program. You have not seen either of them around, have you? Carlos, standing rigidly in the doorway, shook his head. His voice came out surprisingly steady. "No, Sheriff. Just me catching up on filing. You know how it is, paperwork never ends." "That it does not," Crowley agreed. He clapped Carlos on the shoulder hard enough to make the younger man stagger, a gesture that looked friendly, but carried an edge of threat. "You keep those eyes open, boy. If anyone comes snooping around these records, you send word to me right away. There are people trying to undermine important territorial programs that help orphans find good homes and productive work. We cannot let troublemakers ruin things for children who need our help. You understand me?" "Yes, sir. I understand perfectly." "Good lad." Crowley gave the safe one more approving look, then left his boots heavy on the stairs. They waited in frozen silence for a full 10 minutes after the footsteps faded. Only when Carlos was certain Crowley had left the building did they emerge gasping, as if they had been holding their breath underwater. "We cannot take the original," Theodore said, his voice shaking slightly. "If it goes missing tonight, Crowley will know we were here. But Carlos, can you copy pages over the next few weeks, a few at a time, so Wit does not notice anything unusual?" "Yes," Carlos said. He had found a small camera he kept locked in a desk drawer, a stereoscope with glass plates used sometimes to photograph land survey documents. "And I can photograph some pages. It will take time, but I can do it. You need to leave now, though. If Crowley comes back." "We understand," Takala said. They slipped out the back door into the alley. The night air felt cool and clean after the stuffy closeness of the office. They were loading into the wagon when shouts erupted from the direction of the main street. "Someone is in the county office. I saw movement in the windows." Torchlight flickered in the distance, growing rapidly closer. Hooves pounded on packed earth riders moving fast. "Someone saw us after all," Theodore said grimly. "Or Crowley set a trap and we walked right into it." He snapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward. The wagon bounced over ruts and rocks as Theodore urged the animals into a pace they had not been designed for. Behind them, riders appeared around the corner, Crowley and 3 deputies, their horses fresh, their intent deadly. "Faster," Remedios urged. "They are gaining." The chase stretched through Goldwater's dark streets, past shuttered businesses and houses where lamplights began appearing in windows as residents woke to the commotion. A gunshot cracked the bullet, whining past to strike sparks from a metal shop sign. "Return fire," Theodore shouted. "Slow them down." Takala aimed his carbine carefully, not at the men, but at the ground ahead of the lead horse. The shot kicked up dirt and gravel. The horse shied violently, nearly throwing Crowley, buying them precious seconds. Annika grabbed the Winchester that had been stored under the wagon seat. Her first shot went high, deliberately, Takala suspected, not wanting to kill, even in self-defense. Her second shot struck a deputy's hat, sending it flying. The man ducked instinctively, pulling his reins hard, and his horse crashed into the mount beside him. 2 riders went down in a tangle of hooves and cursing. "Turn left at the creek," Takala called to Theodore. "There is a ford shallow enough for the wagon, but with steep banks. Tired horses will struggle more than fresh ones." Theodore yanked the reins, and the wagon careened around the turn, tilting on 2 wheels before slamming back down. The horses plunged into the creek water, spraying silver in the moonlight. The far bank was steep and muddy, forcing the animals to scramble the wagon, fishtailing, as wheels sought purchase. Behind them, Crowley's riders hit the same ford. One horse, already laboring after the hard chase, lost its footing on the muddy bank and went down hard, throwing its rider into the shallows with a tremendous splash. The delay cost them critical seconds, but Crowley himself kept coming. His face twisted with rage, his gun drawn. They made it to the small railroad depot in the next town, a water stop called Pine Ridge, just as a westbound freight train was beginning to pull out. Theodore drove the wagon alongside the slowly accelerating train, matching its pace. "Jump," he yelled. Takala grabbed the ledger pages Carlos had managed to photograph glass plates wrapped carefully in cloth and threw them onto a flat car. Then he helped Remedios jump, catching her as she nearly fell. Annika leaped without hesitation, landing in a crouch. Theodore abandoned the reins and jumped last the wagon, rolling to a stop behind them. The train picked up speed. On the platform, Crowley and his remaining deputy stood watching, the sheriff's face purple with fury, his gun still in his hand, though they were now out of range. Inside a boxcar filled with hay bales, they collapsed, breathing hard, their hearts hammering. "We did not get the original ledger," Theodore said between gasps. "But we got photographs, and Carlos will get us more. It is a start." Annika looked at Takala, her gray eyes reflecting the moonlight that streamed through gaps in the boxcar walls. "Will it be enough?" "It will have to be," Takala replied. "Because Crowley knows now. He knows we are onto him. The war has started whether we are ready or not." They built the school through late August and September, working from dawn until dark every day. The site Waya and Elu had suggested 20 acres of unclaimed land above the Cottonwood River, where an old silver mine had played out years before, proved ideal. High ground with clear views in all directions. Stone available from the mine tailings, water from the river, trees for timber. Takala brought his Lakota kin Waya Elu and several others willing to help despite the risk. Niels Andersson, the Swedish farmer who had known Annika's parents in the old country, arrived with tools and skilled hands. Theodore came whenever his medical practice allowed, bringing supplies purchased with donations from the few townspeople who had been troubled by the auction. Remedios appeared regularly, with books, slates, chalk, and an inexhaustible supply of patience for teaching. The building rose slowly, painfully. Stone walls on the lower level quarried and hauled and fitted together with mortar made from clay and lime. Log walls above each timber cut squared, notched, and raised into place. The roof was planks overlaid with tar paper, the sharp chemical smell lingering for weeks. Through it all, Annika worked alongside the men, her hands blistering and then callousing her arms, growing strong. She learned to fit stones to mix mortar, to hold timbers steady while they were secured. Hannah helped Theodore organize a medical corner with bandages, tinctures, and the precious supplies he could spare. Colette discovered a talent for organization, establishing a kitchen and managing the donations of food that arrived irregularly. Ruth, the youngest, helped where she could and spent hours with Remedios, learning to read, with an intensity that suggested she was trying to devour all the knowledge in the world. One afternoon in early September, as Takala and Annika worked together, squaring a beam for the doorframe, she broke the comfortable silence between them. "Why did you buy us?" she asked quietly. Takala did not answer immediately. He continued working the draw knife, the blade peeling long curls of wood that fell to the ground like golden ribbons. Finally, he said, "I have seen children harmed in this territory. Sometimes I was the instrument of that harm." He felt her attention sharpen, though she did not stop working. 3 years ago, he continued, his voice low, "I was tracking for the army north of the Platte. My job was to find camps Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho. It did not matter which, as long as they were not on their assigned reservation lands. I was told we were looking for hostile bands warriors who had broken treaty and needed to be brought back for their own protection. I believed that. Or I told myself I believed it." He paused, the knife still. "I led soldiers to a winter camp. Families, old people, children. I thought we were going to escort them back to the reservation. Instead," he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "When I saw you on that platform," he said after a moment, "I thought, here's something I can do. Here's a chance to not walk past, to not tell myself it is not my concern, not my responsibility. It will not undo what I have done, but it might balance the scales slightly. That is all." Annika was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You saved us. That is not a small thing." "I bought your contracts," Takala corrected gently. "Saving you will take longer. That is what this is." He gestured at the building rising around them. "This is the beginning of saving you and others. Then we will build it strong," Annika said. She adjusted her grip on the beam. "And you will teach me to shoot better. Not just across a river, really shoot. If we are going to defend this place, I need to be more than adequate." So in the evenings after the day's labor, Takala took Annika and Hannah to a clearing downstream where the sound would not carry directly to Ruby Ridge. He set up targets, tin cans balanced on rocks marks, scratched on tree trunks, playing cards pinned to logs. He taught them to account for wind, to judge distance, to breathe slowly, and squeeze the trigger rather than jerk it, to reload by feel in darkness, to shoot from different positions. Annika learned quickly. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp, and she possessed the kind of focused determination that made her practice, until her shoulder ached from the carbine's recoil, and her ears rang from the reports. Hannah was less naturally gifted, but more patient, willing to repeat the same motion 100 times until it became automatic. "Why do you not teach Colette and Ruth?" Annika asked one evening as they walked back to camp and the setting sun painting the prairie in shades of amber and crimson. "They are too young," Takala replied. 11 and 9 are not ages for learning to kill. There will be time when they are older if circumstances require it. For now, let them be children as much as this world allows." "We were never allowed to be children," Annika said quietly. "Even in the old country before the fever took our parents. Our father died when I was 12. Our mother lingered another 2 years, wasting away. I raised these 3 while working in a textile factory, stealing scraps of food from the foreman's lunch, teaching them to read, using newspapers I pulled from trash bins. When Mother died, we had nothing, no money, no family willing to take us in, nowhere to go. The church put us in the orphan asylum, then onto the train. We have been small adults for years, Takala. Perhaps that is why we survive when others do not." Takala looked at her in the fading light, seeing not just the 16-year-old girl with calloused hands and determined eyes, but the person she was becoming, someone shaped by hardship, but not broken by it, tempered like good steel. "Perhaps," he agreed. "But here you can be something more. Strong, yes. Capable, yes. But not alone. Do you understand the difference?" Annika met his gaze and held it. Something passed between them in that moment, not words, not promises, but recognition, an acknowledgement that they were building something together that mattered, and that neither of them was walking alone anymore. "I am beginning to," she said softly. In Ruby Ridge, Sheriff Amos Crowley's rage had settled into something colder and more dangerous. His income from the indenture auctions had dried up almost completely. Word was spreading quietly, cautiously through networks of people who had lost children or questioned the system about the school on the hill above the Cottonwood River. Some families who had been considering signing contracts for their charges now hesitated, asked questions, demanded to see the placement facilities firsthand. Crowley had sent deputies to inspect the site twice. Both times Tokala had been ready with answers. The land was unclaimed, verified by Theodore's survey maps and a letter from the Territorial Land Office. The building met construction standards outlined in the Territorial Code: minimum wall thickness, adequate ventilation, approved chimney construction. The children were under the legal guardianship of Dr. Theodore Gray, whose credentials were impeccable and whose signature appeared on official forms filed with the county. Legally, Crowley had no grounds to shut them down. But legality was only one tool in his arsenal, and he had many others. He began a campaign of rumors using Magnus as his primary instrument. Magnus, bitter over losing both the girls and the ongoing income they represented, needed little encouragement to spread poison through Ruby Ridge's saloons and shops. That Indian's got 4 white girls up there on that hill. Magnus would say to anyone who would listen, his words slurred, but his malice crystal clear. No proper women around except that Mexican teacher, and everyone knows she is probably his woman anyway. No church oversight, no decent Christian guidance. What do you think he is really doing with them? What do you think happens at night when there is no one to watch? Most people dismissed Magnus as a drunk and a liar, a man whose own failures had twisted him into something mean and petty. But some listened, and some of those began to wonder, to cast suspicious glances toward the hill, to mutter about unnatural situations and something not right. Crowley also sent a carefully worded letter to Harrison Webb in St. Paul, a masterpiece of bureaucratic insinuation that hinted at irregularities in the territorial orphan placement program being investigated by unauthorized individuals, including a physician who may be exceeding his authority, and a former Army scout whose loyalties to the territorial government may be questionable. He suggested that these individuals were gathering information that could prove embarrassing to the territorial administration if misrepresented in certain quarters. Webb's reply came 3 weeks later, delivered by special courier. The message was typed on official territorial letterhead, unsigned but unmistakable in its origin. Handle your territory efficiently. No scandals. No investigations that draw attention. Use whatever resources necessary, but keep it clean. There is too much at stake. The message was clear. Crowley had permission to act, provided he left no evidence that would require Webb to become directly involved. Crowley began planning something more permanent than harassment. The expedition to retrieve the completed ledger copies came in late September, when the first hint of autumn had begun coloring the cottonwood leaves along the river. Carlos had sent word through Remedios that he had finished photographing and copying the most damning sections of the ledger: names, dates, fees, signatures, and most importantly, the correspondence between Horace Witt and Harrison Webb discussing how to maximize efficiency in the placement program, while maintaining plausible oversight structures. Theodore proposed they make the journey with a larger group this time, safety in numbers. So they traveled in 2 wagons, Theodore driving the first with Remedios beside him, Tocala and Annika in the second, disguised as Theodore's medical assistants. Waya and Elu rode alongside on horseback, ostensibly as hired guards, which was not uncommon for valuable cargo traveling through territory where bandits occasionally struck. Carlos met them in the alley behind the county office well after midnight. He carried a leather satchel that seemed to weigh on him both physically and spiritually. "This is everything," he whispered, handing the satchel to Theodore. Photographs of 147 pages, handwritten copies of the correspondence I could access, and one additional thing you need to see. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, his hands trembling. "This is a letter from Crowley to Webb, sent last month. I found it misfiled in the land claims records. I think Witt put it there accidentally, or maybe he was trying to hide it from Crowley." Read it. By the light of Theodore's shuttered lantern, they read, H.W. The Indian Scout is becoming a significant problem. He has disrupted 3 auctions, reduced our monthly revenue by nearly 40%, and is building some kind of school or asylum that gives people alternatives they should not have. Gray and the Mexican teacher are supporting him. I recommend we arrange an accident for all 3, something that looks like Indian troubles or construction mishap. The contracts are too profitable to lose, and the girls he bought can be reclaimed and resold if he's not around to contest it. Need your approval to proceed. A.C. Annika's hand tightened on Tocala's arm, her nails digging in. "They are planning to kill you. To kill all of us." "Yes," Tocala said calmly. "Which means we need to move faster than they expect." Theodore carefully folded the letter and added it to the satchel. This is enough to take to the territorial marshal. With Carlos's testimony and these documents, we can force an investigation that Webb cannot quash. Will the marshal act? Remedios asked. If Webb has as much influence as we believe. Marshal Samuel Garrett answers to the governor, not to Webb, Theodore said. And Governor Marshall has been looking for an excuse to replace Webb for months. There have been other complaints about territorial fund management. This could be the evidence he needs. Then we go to Black Hills, Tokala said, where the marshal maintains his headquarters. How long will it take? 3 days hard travel, Waya said. Maybe 4 if we are cautious. But we should assume Crowley will learn we have these documents. He has spies everywhere. Then we move tonight, Tokala decided. Now, before he can organize a response. They were loading the wagons when the trap closed. Crowley stepped out from the shadow of a building across the alley, his revolver already drawn. With him were 5 deputies, all armed, all positioned to cut off escape routes. The sheriff's face was calm, almost pleasant, which made him infinitely more dangerous than if he had been raging. "Good evening, Theodore," Crowley said conversationally. "Out making house calls at this unusual hour." "Sheriff," Theodore replied, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "We are picking up medical supplies that Carlos arranged for me. Nothing illegal." "Medical supplies," Crowley repeated, in a leather satchel collected at midnight from the county clerk's office. "That is a creative description of stolen government property, Doctor. I believe the more accurate term would be evidence of burglary." "We have stolen nothing," Remedios said firmly. "These are copies of public records which citizens have a right to review." "You have broken into a government building after hours," Crowley countered. "You have photographed documents without authorization. You are in possession of correspondence that falls under official confidentiality." He smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I am afraid I will have to arrest all of you. The territorial court will sort out the details. In the meantime, that satchel needs to be returned to proper custody." He gestured, and 2 deputies moved forward to take the satchel from Theodore. Tokala's hand moved to the knife at his belt. Waya and Elu shifted their horses, reading the situation, preparing to act. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, caught in an open alley with no cover, facing men with drawn weapons and the law on their side. Then a voice called from the far end of the alley, young, uncertain, but determined. "Sheriff Crowley, stop right there." Everyone turned. A figure stood silhouetted against the street lamp, Zachary Pike, the young deputy who had ridden with Crowley on the chase from Goldwater. But now his gun was drawn and pointed not at Tokala, but at Crowley. "Pike." Crowley said, his voice carrying a note of confusion mixed with irritation. "What are you doing? Get over here and help secure these prisoners?" "No, sir," Zachary said. He walked forward slowly, his gun never wavering. "I have been thinking about what we are doing. I have been thinking about it for weeks, actually. Since Goldwater, when you ordered us to chase down a doctor who was just looking at records. Since I heard you talking with Magnus about dealing with the Indian Scout. Since I realized what those contracts really are." He reached into his coat with his free hand and pulled out papers, several sheets folded together. "These are copies of letters between you and Harrison Webb. I made them 3 months ago when you had me filing correspondence. I did not understand what I was reading at the time. I thought it was just administrative stuff about fees and processing. But after Goldwater, I started really reading what I had copied. You are selling children, Sheriff. Not placing them, selling them. And some of them are dying. Pike, you are making a serious mistake." Crowley began, his voice hardening. The mistake was mine, following your orders without asking questions. Zachary interrupted. His voice shook slightly, but his gun hand remained steady. My sister was on an orphan train 6 years ago. I was 16, freshly arrived from Ohio, and I could not take care of her. They told me she went to a good family in Colorado, but I never heard from her again. I always wondered if maybe she had forgotten me, or if the family moved, or if she just did not want to remember her past. But now I know. She is probably in that ledger, is she not sold to someone who worked her until she died or disappeared? He looked at Theodore. Is Mary Pike in those records? Theodore opened the satchel with trembling hands, pulled out the copied pages, and began scanning names. After a moment, he stopped. His voice was gentle. Yes. Mary Pike, aged 12 at the time of placement, sold to a cattle operation in Wyoming Territory, listed as deceased 1 year later. Cause exposure and exhaustion following attempted escape. Zachary's face crumpled. For a moment, he looked like he might weep. Then his expression hardened into something cold and final. You killed my sister, Sheriff. You and Webb and everyone else who profits from this system. And I will not let you kill anyone else. He raised his voice, calling down the alley toward the street. Marshal Garrett, they are here. From the street came the sound of multiple horses moving fast. 6 riders appeared, led by a tall man in his 50s, wearing a federal marshal's badge. Samuel Garrett had a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled or intimidated. Amos Crowley. Garrett said, his voice carrying absolute authority. I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, human trafficking, and attempted murder. Your deputies are ordered to stand down immediately or face federal charges as accessories. Crowley's face went through a rapid series of changes, shock rage calculation. His hand tightened on his gun. You have no jurisdiction here, Garrett. This is a county matter, and I am the duly elected sheriff. You cannot just ride in and... I have a warrant signed by Governor Marshall. Garrett interrupted, pulling a folded document from his coat, based on information provided by Deputy Pike 3 days ago when he rode to Black Hills and told me what he suspected. The governor has suspended your authority pending investigation. Now drop your weapon, or I will add resisting arrest to the charges. For a moment, it seemed Crowley might fight. His gun was still pointed at Theodore, his finger on the trigger. The deputies looked uncertain, their weapons shifting between targets, unsure where their loyalties should lie. Then Zachary did something that later became legendary in the territory. He stepped directly between Crowley and Theodore, putting his own body in the line of fire. You will have to shoot me first, Zachary said quietly. And if you do, these 5 marshals will cut you down before your gun comes level for a second shot. It is over, Sheriff. Put it down. Crowley stared at the young deputy who had betrayed him. Then slowly his hand opened, and his revolver fell to the dirt. The siege came on a moonless night in late September, when the air hung thick and heavy, despite the season turning. Takala had known it was coming. Crowley might be under arrest, but his release on bail pending trial, arranged through connections that still functioned despite the governor's intervention, meant he was desperate, cornered, and more dangerous than ever. The trial was scheduled for early October. If the ledger and Carlos's testimony reached the courtroom, Crowley would hang. Harrison Webb would be indicted. The entire child-selling network would collapse. Desperate men do desperate things. Takala stood near the schoolhouse door, leaning on the crutch that had become necessary after his leg had been broken a week earlier. He had been helping Niels raise the final roof beam when a supporting rope had snapped. The beam had swung wild and Takala had pushed Hannah out of its path, but the beam's end had caught his lower leg against a stone wall. The break was clean. Theodore had said it well, but it would be weeks before he could walk without the crutch, months before he could run or fight properly. In a siege situation that was potentially a death sentence, he would have to command from a fixed position, trusting others to execute movements he could not make himself. "They are coming," Waya called from the west window, his voice calm but urgent. "I count at least 20 men, maybe 25, some carrying torches. They are spreading out to surround us." Takala issued orders, his voice carrying through the single large room that served as classroom, dormitory, and fortress. "Niels, take the left window. You have the best aim with a rifle. Waya, right window. Elu, south wall, that is where they will try to come up the slope because the angle is easiest. Theodore, guard the back door. Do not let anyone approach unseen. Annika." "I know," she said, already moving. "Get the children to the storage room." She moved through the sleeping forms with practiced efficiency, touching shoulders, whispering urgently. The children woke with the discipline of those who had been trained for this possibility. Ruth and her sisters, plus 7 others who had arrived over the past weeks, runaways from bad placements, children pulled from a derailed orphan train, refugees from situations even worse than contracts. They filed silently into the stone-walled storage room at the back of the building, a space originally intended for food and supplies, but reinforced specifically to serve as a last refuge. Hannah followed them in carrying blankets and a jar of water. "Stay quiet," she whispered to the children huddled in the darkness. "No matter what you hear, stay quiet and stay low." Outside, Crowley's voice boomed up from the darkness below, amplified by the valley's natural acoustics. "Takala, I know you are in there. I have a proposition for you. Send out those girls, the 4 you bought, and that ledger, and we will talk in town like civilized men. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight. This can end peacefully." Takala did not answer. Answering would only give away his exact position and waste time they might need. Crowley waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a night bird. When no response came, Crowley's voice hardened. "You bring this on yourselves," he called. "I tried to do this the legal way. You forced my hand. Boys, burn them out. I want that ledger ash and those witnesses dead by sunrise." Gunfire erupted, shattering the night. The first volley was ragged men shooting at shadows and uncertain targets, more to terrify than to hit. Bullets struck the stone walls and ricocheted with sparks and angry whines. One shattered a window glass, exploding inward and showering the floor with glittering fragments. Another punched through a wooden shutter, splinters flying, and buried itself in the far wall. Inside, the defenders returned fire with disciplined precision. Waya, an experienced hunter who had brought down elk at 200 yards, fired methodically, each shot carefully aimed. Niels targeted the torchbearers, specifically trying to eliminate the fire threat. Takala positioned by the door, where he could observe multiple angles, without needing to move much, directed fields of fire with quiet authority. "Waya, they are circling left toward the corral. 2 shots at the fence line to push them back. Niels' movement near that large rock outcrop. Someone is trying to work their way closer under cover. Elu watched the south approach. I saw shadows moving through that stand of scrub oak." The siege settled into a tense rhythm of violence. Bursts of gunfire, sharp and bright in the darkness. Periods of silence where both sides reloaded and reassessed. Shouts and curses from outside as men scrambled for cover or called instructions to each other. The acrid smell of burned powder filled the air, mixing with dust and sweat and fear. Outside, Crowley grew increasingly impatient. His plan had been to overwhelm the building quickly, with numbers, seize the ledger, and eliminate witnesses before anyone from town could respond to the noise. But the defenders were proving more effective than he had anticipated. Several of his men had already been wounded by precise rifle fire, and the rest were reluctant to charge across open ground into aimed shots. He needed to force the issue to create panic and chaos that would drive the defenders out. He signaled to Magnus and 2 other men, gesturing them toward the back of the building with specific instructions. Magnus, drunk on whiskey and rage, and the promise of reclaiming his property, moved with reckless confidence. He carried a large tin container, a kerosene lantern from the saloon, the kind used for outdoor lighting, holding nearly a gallon of fuel. Magnus approached the south wall, where log construction met stone foundation, splashing kerosene liberally against the wood on the ground, across the pile of scrap lumber and wood shavings that had accumulated during construction and not yet been cleared away. The sharp smell of kerosene cut through the powder smoke. He lit a torch, a piece of lumber wrapped with oil-soaked rags. The flame roared to life, bright and hungry. But Magnus's hands were unsteady, his coordination impaired by alcohol and adrenaline. As he prepared to throw the torch onto the kerosene-soaked wall, the lantern slipped from his other hand. The metal container hit the ground hard. The lid came loose. Kerosene poured out in a spreading pool. Magnus tried to catch the lantern, stumbled, and dropped the torch. The kerosene ignited with a whoosh that sucked air from nearby lungs. Fire leapt upward, following the trail of fuel racing across the ground and up the log wall faster than a man could run. The scrap lumber pile caught instantly, turning into a bonfire that roared and crackled and threw sparks into the air. Magnus stumbled backward, his beard and eyebrows singed, cursing incoherently. The other 2 men tried to beat out the flames with their coats, but it was already far too late. The fire had found the tar paper on the roof, and tar paper burned with intense, almost unquenchable heat. Within 2 minutes, flames were consuming the south wall, climbing toward the roof, spreading along the dry wooden shingles despite the layer of tar meant to protect them. Inside the building, smoke began to seep under the interior doors, thick and acrid, burning throats and eyes. The children in the storage room started coughing, their quiet discipline breaking as fear overwhelmed training. "Fire!" someone shouted. "The building is on fire." Theodore ran to the back windows, looking out at the flames climbing the exterior wall. His face went pale. "We cannot stay inside. The roof is going to collapse. We need to evacuate now." "Where?" Niels demanded. "They are waiting out there to shoot anyone who comes out. We go through the back window." Tokala said, his voice cutting through the rising panic with forceful calm. "It is narrow, but the children can fit. Annika, you go first. Drop down and check for shooters. Signal when it is clear, then we send the children through one at a time." "What about you?" Annika asked, looking at his broken leg. "You cannot climb through that window." "I will manage," Tokala lied. "Go, now." They shoved the heavy oak table across the floor, the legs gouging tracks in the wood, and positioned it beneath the back window. The window was small, designed deliberately that way for defense, and set high in the wall. But it was the only exit that faced away from the main concentration of attackers. Annika climbed onto the table, her movements quick despite her fear. She kicked out the glass with the heel of her boot, jagged shards falling inside and outside. Dangerous, but necessary. She peered out into the smoke-filled darkness. 2 men were visible near the corral, perhaps 50 yards away, reloading their rifles. But they were focused on the front of the building, not the back. "Clear for now," she called down. Then she grabbed the window frame, pulled herself up with strength built from weeks of construction work, and dropped through into the night. She landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact, as Tokala had taught her during their shooting practices. Her shoulder hit dirt and rock pane flaring, but nothing broke. She came up in a crouch, her carbine in her hands, scanning the darkness. "Send them," she called up to the window. Inside, smoke was now pouring into the main room, thick enough to obscure vision beyond a few feet. The heat was becoming intense, the roar of the fire a physical presence. A beam in the roof cracked with a sound like a gunshot, making everyone jump. Theodore and Niels began lifting children through the window one by one. Ruth, first her small body easy to handle. She dropped into Annika's waiting arms. Then the others, the youngest children, first the ones who would be slowest to escape if the building collapsed. One by one they went through the window, dropped into the night, and were caught by Annika or crawled away toward the rocks 50 yards downslope, where Elu had positioned himself to provide covering fire. Hannah went through. Then Colette, the older children, Remedios, who climbed with surprising agility for a woman of her years. Niels. Elu came in from the south window and went through. Theodore turned to Tokala. Your turn. I cannot climb through that window, Tokala said flatly. My leg will not support my weight for the pull-up, and I cannot balance to drop safely. Then I will lower you through by rope, Theodore said. He was already pulling rope from the emergency supplies, looping it under Tokala's arms in a makeshift harness. There is no time, Tokala said. The roof beam cracked again, louder this time. The entire structure groaned, sagging visibly in the middle. Flames were eating through the support timbers, and when they failed, the entire roof would collapse inward, turning the room into an inferno that would kill anyone still inside within seconds. There is no time, Tokala repeated. Theodore, go. That is an order. I am not under your command, Theodore said stubbornly, pulling the rope tight. And I did not spend 3 months building this place just to watch you die in it. Now hold still. He climbed onto the table, prepared to lift Tokala. The window darkened. A figure appeared from outside, silhouetted against the faint light from the stars and the fire's glow. Annika. She had climbed back up using handholds in the stone wall and sheer determination. Give him to me, she shouted over the roar of the fire. Lift him to the window. I will pull from this side, you push from that side. Together, Theodore pushing from below, Annika pulling from above, and Tokala doing his best to help. Despite the blinding pain in his leg, they managed to maneuver him through the narrow window. His shoulders scraped the frame, leaving skin behind. His broken leg caught on the sill, and he could not suppress a cry of agony. But then he was through. Falling Annika and Niels caught him, their combined strength barely sufficient to keep him from crashing onto the rocks below. They lowered him as gently as possible, but even so the impact sent white-hot daggers of pain through his shattered leg. Theodore came through the window last, just as the roof collapsed inward with a roar like thunder. The entire structure shuddered, flames shooting upward into the night sky, sparks swirling like demon fireflies. They lay gasping in the dirt, coughing smoke from their lungs, and their faces streaked with soot and sweat, as the building they had spent months constructing was consumed in minutes. Down the slope, a new sound emerged from the chaos. Hoofbeats, many of them coming fast. Shouts that were not from Crowley's men. Marshal, someone yelled. Federal marshals, everyone stand down. Marshal Samuel Garrett rode into the firelight at the head of a dozen riders, not just marshals, but townspeople from Ruby Ridge as well. The blacksmith whose niece had been sold through the contracts. The widow who had donated fabric. The Mexican freighter who had supplied nails. The shopkeeper. People who had finally been pushed beyond their ability to look away. Zachary Pike was among them, and he rode straight toward where Crowley stood directing his men. The young deputy carried the leather satchel containing the ledger copies and correspondence, and he held it high where everyone could see. This is what he is killing for, Zachary shouted, his voice carrying across the hilltop. Names of children sold like cattle fees, paid to sheriffs and clerks and territorial officials, records of deaths and disappearances, your children, your neighbors' children sold and worked to death, while men like Crowley grew rich. He rode to the blacksmith, Marcus Brennan, and thrust the satchel at him. Your daughter is in here, Marcus Sarah Brennan. Do you remember when she disappeared 3 years ago? Crowley told you she had been placed with a good family in Denver, remember? She is listed in this ledger as being sold to a mining camp in the Black Hills. Listed as deceased 8 months after placement. Cause of death, lung disease and complications. She was 13 years old. Marcus opened the satchel with trembling hands, pulled out the copied pages, and began reading by the light of the burning building. His face went from confusion to disbelief, to a rage so profound it seemed to physically transform him. You told me she went to a good family, Marcus said, his voice shaking as he looked at Crowley. You shook my hand and told me she would be well cared for, that the placement system was designed to help orphans find better lives. You lied to my face while my daughter was dying in a mine. That ledger is falsified, Crowley said quickly, his mind working desperately to construct a defense. Fabricated by enemies of the territory, by that Indian and his accomplices. They are trying to undermine important programs that help children. Your handwriting is in this ledger, Zachary interrupted, pulling out additional sheets. I have compared it to official documents you signed. The writing matches. And I have correspondence letters between you and Harrison Webb discussing how to maximize revenue streams and minimize oversight complications. Written in your hand, Sheriff. Undeniable. The crowd that had ridden up with Crowley, men he had recruited with promises of payment or threats of consequences, men who had believed they were defending the town against dangerous troublemakers, began to waver. Some lowered their weapons. Others looked at each other with dawning horror, realizing they had been manipulated into attempted murder. Is this true? One man asked, his voice breaking. Are we here to protect a child selling operation? It is all legal, Crowley began. My nephew. Another man interrupted, his face twisted with grief. Peter Kowalski, age 10. The train took him 3 years ago. We were told he went to a farming family in Nebraska. Is he in that ledger? Theodore, who had made his way down the slope despite his injuries, took the pages from Marcus and scanned the names. Yes. Peter Kowalski, sold to a lumber camp in Minnesota. Status deceased 1 year post-placement. Cause accident during logging operations. A woman in the crowd began to weep, her sobs harsh and broken. Others looked sick, their faces pale in the firelight. Crowley, seeing the mood turn decisively against him, made his final desperate move. He drew his revolver with sudden speed and aimed not at the marshal or at Zachary, but at Tokala, who lay on the ground 50 feet away, too injured to move quickly, an easy target. This is his fault, Crowley snarled. All of it. He interfered with legal proceedings, he stole government property, he turned decent people against their own interests. It ends. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. The first came from Zachary Pike, who had drawn and fired with a speed born of desperation. His bullet struck Crowley's wrist, shattering bone, sending the sheriff's revolver flying through the air to land in the dirt. The second came from Annika, who had kept her carbine and fired from a kneeling position. Her shot struck Crowley's shoulders, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Both young people, deputy and refugee, had fired to stop, not to kill. But the message was unmistakable. It is over, Crowley, Zachary said, his gun still trained on the sheriff. It has been over since the moment you decided children were commodities instead of human beings. Marshal Garrett dismounted and walked to where Crowley knelt in the dirt, clutching his shattered wrist and bleeding shoulder. Amos Crowley, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, the buying and selling of children, corruption, attempted murder, and arson. I have warrants signed by both the territorial and federal courts. Your trial will be in federal jurisdiction, where your local connections mean nothing. Several of Crowley's men were also arrested, those who had participated knowingly in the trafficking or tonight's attack. But Garrett made a point of distinguishing between willing conspirators and those who had been deceived. Some of you came here tonight because you believed you were defending your town, the marshal said, addressing the crowd. You were lied to. That does not excuse attempted murder, but it will be taken into account. Anyone who lays down their weapons now and testifies truthfully about who organized this attack will be treated as witnesses rather than defendants. Guns clattered to the ground as men rushed to disassociate themselves from Crowley's plans. In the chaos, one final act of violence played out. Magnus Olsson, his face burned from the fire. He had accidentally started drunk and enraged and fixated on the idea that he could still somehow profit from this disaster, stumbled toward the burning building. He was convinced, with the logic of the intoxicated and desperate, that a strongbox containing money must be hidden inside, that he could retrieve it before the building fully collapsed, that he could escape this night with something to show for his troubles. Magnus, no! Someone shouted. The building is coming down. But Magnus either did not hear or did not care. He ran directly into the burning structure through a gap in the collapsing south wall, disappearing into smoke and flames. 5 seconds later, a massive roof beam, the central ridge beam that had taken 8 men to raise, collapsed. The sound was tremendous, like a cannon firing. The entire roof came down in a cascade of burning wood and sparks. Magnus's scream was brief and terrible, then silent. No one was foolish enough or strong enough to go in after him. The heat was too intense, the structure too unstable. They could only watch as the building that had been intended as a refuge burned to its stone foundations, consuming Magnus's body, along with everything else flammable. He killed himself with his own greed. Waya observed quietly, standing beside Tokala. A fitting end. Tokala said nothing. He was looking at the children, all of them accounted for, all alive, huddled together under blankets someone had provided, being checked by Theodore for injuries. Ruth clung to Hannah. Colette sat with Remedios, her face blank with shock. Annika stood apart, her carbine still in her hands, her eyes scanning the darkness as if expecting another attack. We will rebuild, Tokala said finally. Bigger, stronger, and this time with federal recognition and funding. Yes, Waya agreed. This time they will not be able to burn it down. Marshal Garrett returned with the first light of dawn, leading 2 wagons. One contained food and medical supplies. The other carried a man in chains, Horace Witt, the county clerk from Goldwater, who had been arrested overnight when federal marshals raided his office and seized the original master ledger, along with years of correspondence. Garrett gathered everyone who was still present, the defenders, the townspeople, the children, and made a statement that would later be recorded in territorial history. What happened here last night was an attempt to destroy evidence and silence witnesses who threatened to expose a criminal conspiracy that reached from this town to the territorial capital. That attempt failed. As of this morning, Harrison Webb has been taken into federal custody in St. Paul. The governor has suspended his authority and ordered a complete audit of territorial orphan placement programs. Those programs are now frozen pending investigation. He turned to look at the smoking ruins of the school. This building is gone. But what it represented, a place where children could find safety outside a corrupt system, will not be allowed to die. I have been authorized by the governor to grant this land official territorial status as an orphan asylum and educational facility. Funding will be provided for reconstruction. Dr. Theodore Gray and Ms. Remedios Ortega have been appointed as co-administrators, with Mr. Tokala Hanska serving as security advisor and cultural liaison. He paused, letting that sink in. Furthermore, the territorial legislature will convene in special session next month to consider comprehensive reform of child welfare laws. The governor has indicated he will support legislation that prohibits group auctions of labor, contracts, requires judicial oversight for all placements, and establishes rights of appeal for children who believe they are being mistreated. Annika, standing with her sisters, felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. "You mean, it is really over? The auctions, the contracts, all of it?" "The old system is over," Garrett confirmed. "What replaces it will depend on people like you, people willing to build something better." The trial of Amos Crowley and Harrison Webb took place in federal court in St. Paul in late October, after leaves had turned gold and red and begun to fall. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks. Carlos Mendoza testified, bringing the master ledger and explaining how the system operated. Zachary Pike testified, providing letters and correspondence. Theodore testified about the health clearances and what they revealed about mortality rates. Remedios testified about children who had disappeared from her classroom, and Annika testified, speaking for herself and her sisters and all the other children who had passed through the system. She spoke clearly and without emotion, simply recounting facts: the orphan train, the auction, the conditions at Magnus's homestead, the night of the siege. Her testimony was devastating precisely because she did not embellish or appeal to emotion. She simply told the truth. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Amos Crowley was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to hang. The execution was carried out in November, witnessed by several families whose children had died in placements he had arranged. Harrison Webb was found guilty of conspiracy and corruption, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He died there in the 3rd year of his sentence, his health broken, his reputation destroyed. Horace Witt, turned territorial evidence, testified against both Crowley and Webb and received a reduced sentence of 10 years in exchange for his cooperation. He served 8 years before being released on parole. A broken man who spent the rest of his life working as a clerk in a general store. His ambitions destroyed. The new school rose from the ashes of the old through the autumn and into winter, built with territorial funds and volunteer labor. This time the structure was larger, sturdier, designed by an actual architect, hired by the territorial government. All stone on the lower level, 2 feet thick, capable of withstanding fire or siege. Log walls above double-chinked for warmth. A slate roof that would not burn. Multiple exits for safety. Separate dormitories for boys and girls. A real classroom with proper desks and a library. An infirmary with equipment Theodore had only dreamed of before. Above the main door, a carved wooden sign was mounted in a ceremony attended by the governor himself. Ruby Ridge Territorial Orphan Asylum and School, the House of 4 Sisters. The name had been Annika's suggestion, and the territorial board had approved it unanimously. It served both as a memorial to what the sisters had endured and as a promise that what they had built would endure. By December, the school housed 23 children. Some came from orphan trains that now stopped at Ruby Ridge by law, allowing children to be interviewed by the territorial board and placed only after approval by multiple parties, including Lakota representatives. Others were children who had been in bad placements and escaped, drawn by stories of the school where they would be safe. Still others were simply homeless children of the frontier, cast adrift by death or disaster, who had nowhere else to go. Annika, now 17, taught arithmetic and geography alongside Remedios. She had discovered she had a talent for teaching, for making complex ideas comprehensible, for seeing when a student was struggling and needed a different approach. Hannah, 15, worked with Theodore in the infirmary, and was beginning to study medicine properly with textbooks Theodore ordered from St. Paul. Colette, 12, ran the kitchen with efficiency that would have impressed an army quartermaster. Ruth, 10, was devouring books at a rate that astonished Remedios, already reading at a level appropriate for children several years older. Tokala walked the perimeter fence each morning, his leg healed, but forever stiff, his gait marked by a slight limp that he had learned to accommodate. He no longer wore the war bonnet except on formal occasions. Daily life required practicality, not ceremony, but he had not abandoned his identity. He dressed in buckskin, wore his hair in traditional braids, and made sure the Lakota children at the school learned their language and traditions, alongside English and arithmetic. His relationship with Annika had deepened through autumn, built on the foundation of shared danger and shared purpose. They did not speak of romance in the way white society might expect. There were no declarations of love, no formal courtship rituals. But they were partners in everything that mattered. When a wagon needed repair, they worked on it together, their hands moving in practiced coordination. When decisions needed to be made about the school, they consulted each other, first trusting each other's judgment. When children needed discipline or comfort, they presented a united front, two people so in sync, they rarely needed to discuss tactics beforehand. One cold December evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Tokala found Annika on the porch of the new building, watching the valley below turn white under the pale moonlight. He came to stand beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The future," Annika replied. 6 months ago, I thought we had no future. Just survival day by day, until we were old enough to be free of Magnus's contract. Now we have this. She gestured at the building behind them, the warm light spilling from windows, the sound of children's voices singing, as Remedios taught them a song. It does not feel entirely real sometimes. "It is real," Tokala said. "You made it real. You and your sisters and everyone who refused to accept that the old system was the only possibility." Annika was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What will you do when we no longer need protecting? When the school is established and safe and the threats have passed?" "Do you believe the threats will pass?" Tokala asked. "There will always be people who see children as commodities, who value profit over human life. The system we broke was not unique. It was just one version of something that exists in many forms. So I will stay. I will teach children to defend themselves, to read the land, to survive. And I will be here in case old threats return or new ones emerge." "Good," Annika said quietly. "Because I am staying too. This is home now. These children are my family as much as my blood sisters. I will not leave them." Tokala turned to look at her, seeing not just the girl who had stood terrified on an auction platform 6 months ago, but the woman she was becoming, strong, determined, scarred by hardship, but not broken by it. "Then we will stay together," he said. It was not a question or a proposal in the traditional sense, but a statement of fact, a recognition of what already existed between them. Annika slipped her hand into his, a simple gesture that carried the weight of commitment. "Together?" she agreed. Below them the valley stretched white and peaceful under falling snow. The river ran black and cold between banks that would ice over by January. And on the hill, the school stood warm and bright smoke rising from chimneys, a beacon of possibility in a harsh land. In the spring, the territorial legislature passed what came to be known as the Four Sisters Act. Though the official title was an act for the reform of child welfare and protection in the territory. The legislation was comprehensive, addressing not just orphan placements, but labor laws affecting all children, establishing minimum standards for treatment, creating oversight boards, with representation from multiple communities, and most importantly, abolishing the practice of auctioning children's labor contracts. A copy of the signed act, framed and mounted, was hung in the school's main hall directly opposite the entrance. Students would see it every day, a reminder that laws could be changed, that systems could be broken, that justice was possible if enough people refused to accept injustice. Tokala received official recognition from the territorial government, back pay for his scout service, a commendation from the governor, and formal appointment as cultural liaison and security advisor for the territorial orphan program. The position came with a modest salary and, more importantly, authority to intervene in placements he believed were inappropriate. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In late May, a delegation of Lakota elders from the reservation visited the school. They had heard about what Tokala had built, about the partnership between Lakota and white communities, about children being taught both cultures and both languages. The eldest among them, a man named Red Cloud, who had fought in the old wars and now fought with words and negotiation, spoke to the assembled school. "What you have built here is what we hoped the treaties would bring a way for our people and white people to live without one destroying the other. Children learning both ways strong in both traditions. This school is a bridge. We honor it, and we will send children here because we believe they will be safe and respected." It was, Tokala thought, perhaps the greatest validation he could have received, not from the territorial government or white authorities, but from his own people acknowledging that he had found a way to walk between worlds without betraying either. On a warm June morning, the school held its first formal graduation ceremony. 3 students' children who had arrived through various tragic circumstances and had completed a course of study equivalent to 8th grade were presented with certificates of completion signed by Remedios Theodore and the Territorial Education Board. The ceremony was attended by families who had adopted some of the school's children through the new, carefully monitored placement system, by townspeople from Ruby Ridge who had come to see the school as a source of community pride rather than suspicion, by Lakota families whose children attended classes, by Marshal Garrett and several of his deputies, including Zachary Pike, who had been promoted and now served as a primary liaison between the Marshal's office and child welfare programs, and by several young people who had once been on orphan trains themselves, who had survived their own versions of Magnus and Crowley, and who had traveled hundreds of miles to see the place that was trying to ensure other children would not suffer as they had. Among them was a young woman who introduced herself as Clara Jansen, the same Clara whose name Annika had recognized in the ledger months ago. Clara had been working in a laundry in Deadwood, trapped by a contract that should have expired, but was being illegally extended. When news of the Four Sisters Act reached Deadwood, she had taken the new law to a territorial judge, had her contract voided, and had begun the process of rebuilding her life. "I came to say thank you," Clara told Annika. "You probably do not remember me from the train. We were only together for 2 days before I was taken off in Nebraska." "I remember you," Annika said. "You shared your bread with Ruth when the conductors only gave us 1 meal a day. You told us stories about your grandmother in Germany. I thought about you, often wondering where you were." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I thought about you too. When I heard what you did, standing up, fighting back, building this place, I thought if she can do that, maybe I can find the courage to demand my freedom. So here I am. Free. Because of you." "Not because of me," Annika corrected gently. "Because of all of us together. One person cannot break a system. But many people, all refusing to accept the system, can break anything." That afternoon, as families departed and children returned to their studies or chores, Tokala and Annika walked down to the river where they had first fought off Deke and his men nearly a year ago. The willows were green now, full of birdsong, the water running clear and cold over the gravel. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been if I had not been at that auction?" Tokala asked. Annika considered the question seriously. I think one of us would have died in the first year, she said. Probably Ruth, she was the most fragile. The rest of us would have survived because that is what we do, but we would have been smaller, harder. More like Magnus maybe using cruelty as a tool because it was the only tool we were given. So no, I do not often think about that life because it is too terrible to contemplate. And now? Tokala asked. What do you think about now? The future, Annika said. She turned to face him, her gray eyes clear and direct. I think about the school in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. I think about how many children will pass through it, how many will learn they have worth and choices and power. I think about you and me still here older and probably grayer, still teaching and building and refusing to accept injustice. She paused, then added quietly, I think about a life that matters, that leaves the world better than we found it. That is what I think about. Tokala reached out and took her hand, and their fingers interlacing with the familiarity of long practice. Then that is what we will build, he said. For as long as we live. They stood together by the river as the sun moved across the sky. Two people who had been thrown together by chance and had chosen to stay together by will, watching the water flow endlessly toward a future that was still being written. Above them on the hill, the school stood solid and permanent, its windows catching the afternoon light, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney where Colette was preparing the evening meal. Children played in the yard under Hannah's watchful eye. In the classroom, Remedios's voice could be heard teaching a history lesson. And over the main door, the carved sign proclaimed to anyone who passed, the House of Four Sisters. A refuge, a school, a promise kept. And on the horizon, the sun continued its arc toward evening, painting the prairie in shades of gold, and amber illuminating a land that was harsh and beautiful, and full of possibility for those strong enough to claim it.